This is Granddaddy Speaks. We wish you welcome. I'm Andy Beverly. We're going to talk about an ancient man who was sort of marvelous in many ways. And if you talk to your grandfather or your grandmother or one of your older relatives and say, what do you call somebody that's real rich? You'll hear them say, rich as Croesus. And so Croesus is who we're going to talk about. Now, a long time ago, long before the Roman Empire got great and long before a lot of the famous things came along in the way of big empires in the world, there was this island. And the name of the island was Rhodes. Rhodes. And the king on that island was named Croesus. And he was a good king. He loved his people and he cared a lot about them. And so what Croesus did was things that would help his people and the people that came and used his island as a place for the harbor to put their boats when in the long ago days when they would bring their boat in and park it while the wind blew and the storm came, and then they'd be safe afterward. And so we're going to talk about this wonderful man and the things he did, and we're going to talk about three things that Croesus did. Croesus got in the habit of taking off his robes as a king and putting on raggedy clothes and putting some soot or some smudge on his face and messing his hair up so he didn't look like a king at all. And he'd get a pot or something and be carrying it and look like some laborer working in the island doing something. And he'd go around watching the people to see if there was something he needed to do to help them out, like a very good leader might do, to just go in disguise and see what the people need and then maybe help them some way. And so Croesus noticed that people would take a little lump of gold because they hadn't started having money in the accepted sense, but they knew that gold had value. They would take a little lump of gold or silver, and when they wanted to buy something, the merchant that they were buying it from would cut off little pieces of their gold. Gold's soft when you don't put anything else in it. If you had a ring or a bracelet that had 100% gold in it, it would be pretty soft, and you could probably take just a kitchen steak knife and cut right through it. But certainly you could with anything very sharp. And so what they did, they'd carve off a little bit and put it in the scale. And on one side was a weight, and on the other side was a little saucer where you put it. And they were looking for an exact weight. And when they got that weight of gold or silver, then they'd say, okay, this is how much I want for what you're trying to buy from me. And he would have been shaving it with his knife or his chisel, getting a little piece off till he got that thing just right. And Croesus said, you know, that seems like a kind of a slow way to do business. And he watched that for a while, and he went back to his castle where he lived, and he got talking to his blacksmiths who would melt iron. They had just gotten into the Iron Age, and they knew how to do things with iron and bronze. Bronze is a mix of copper and tin, and they could make things that were out of metal by melting it and putting it in a mold so it would get in the shape that they wanted, and then they could sharpen it up if it was to be something to cut or do whatever you wanted it to do, make it into the shape of a spoon if you were going to eat with it. And so they had to use these molds because they didn't have machines. They had to do everything with hammers and things that looked kind of like a screwdriver but was called a chisel and other things that they had made themselves. And so he said, can y'all make me some things that look like shells. Shells, beautiful shells in the water, round, because out there in their water there were kind of some things that had round shells and that were kind of pretty. Can you make me some of those things and make them fairly well round, put a mold and melt me some of this gold or silver in there and keep it thin at the right thickness. Have a line where you know how thick you want it, and I want it about that thick, about as thick as you find coins today, because he kind of set the stage for that. And guess what? They started making them, and on one side they would take a thing that they had kind of carved using stone to carve away some of the metal, and it had looked kind of like a very primitive kind of like the face of a king, and they would take that soft gold and say, put it right down on that round piece of gold and say boom boom with a big heavy hammer, and it would sink in and there'd be a face. And then they turn it over and put another one in there and say boom boom, and there would be the symbol of the island of Rhodes. And he produced all this coinage that would be like today's coins. And guess what? Everybody started finding out about it because it worked. And the people in the island used it as they earned money from the king for things they were doing. They got that money in circulation. And people from other countries would take some of that money back, and other countries started using it. But as far as I can tell from all the stuff I've ever read or heard, Croesus made the first coins. And by doing so, he made his island very famous. Rhodes became a famous place for the big ships that they were beginning to invent that carried cargoes of things that people wanted that grew somewhere else or that were made somewhere else. And in Rhodes, what they had something very good to trade, gold coins. And they would send the ship back with a bag of gold coins, and they would have all the things they needed on their island. And so that was the first thing he did. The very first thing he did. Croesus noticed that a lot of times boats during a storm or trying to come into his harbor where they parked the boats while they were selling the goods or buying the goods on Rhodes, for that matter. While they were there doing business, they would come into the harbor and park the boats. Some of them would be trying to come in at night and wreck their boats and miss the way to go into the harbor and run up on the shore and tear up their boats, and it was terrible. And so Croesus said, you know, there must be something I can do. And so he got some of the very best people in the world at making big statues. He got them from Greece, and he got them from other places to come to his island. And they designed a giant statue of a man. That feet were so far apart that they went on both sides of the harbor. That's like going from your front yard to your backyard, or even 4 times that big. And it went 100 cubits. A cubit is from your elbow to the end of your longest finger. It went 100 cubits into the air. And it was a man standing there with his feet on the sides of the harbor, so that you knew if you went right between there you wouldn't have a wreck. And in his hands was a big iron basket. And at night, the workers that worked at that big statue would go up the ladder on the back side of the statue and put logs and wood in there and set it on fire, and the fire would be going up, and the people far out on the sea, and the wind was starting to blow, and they were getting worried if would they have a wreck coming to shore, would see that light, and they'd know, and they'd come in there, and if they went between the legs, and there the legs were with the light showing on them from the statue, because it wasn't a bowl, it was just a basket made of metal, but the light was going out in all directions because it wasn't a bowl, it was just metal strips. And they could see those legs down there and go between them and save themselves. And they called that thing, because it was so big, the word for something that's really big and important is sometimes called colossal. And they called it the Colossus of Rhodes. And as far as anybody can find out, it was one of the very first lighthouses ever on earth. And Croesus put it right there at the harbor of Rhodes. The Colossus of Rhodes that saved lives and brought ships ashore. The last thing he did that I can think of today, and probably it's because when you're 80 years old you don't think of everything the same day. But the last thing I think of today, is that he was the first person that I ever heard of and can find out, and I have been an insurance professor since I was 21 right up to today when I'm 80. And so the last thing that he did was he invented the idea of having people who had things valuable on their ship, or whose ship itself got sunk, would get paid if they put money down, and then if there was a bad loss, got paid. And that's how insurance works. You pay money to the insurance company, but if your house burns down, then you get paid so you can start a new house. And so what he did, he had every ship that worked in and out of his harbor give a percentage of money to the Pontifex Maximus, which was the high priest of his harbor, his island kingdom. And this high priest saved that money and had guards around the temple to keep anybody from coming in and trying to steal the money. And his guards were very good soldiers with very sharp swords, so nobody tried to steal the money. And then if a ship got sunk, or a cargo got lost, or both, the families wouldn't be in poverty and go into slavery like happened in old times when people couldn't pay their bills. They wouldn't have that terrible thing happen. The moms and the children would get the money and be able to live and continue and grow up, and even maybe start a new ship, because the money was worth the amount of the ship, and the tax on it was enough to pay that. And that was the first time I can find in history, going back as far as I've been able to as a professor of insurance, that somebody was really selling insurance, not selling it, but making people buy it for their own good. Because you're not taking some of that money away from the owner of the ship to help you. You're going to give that money to his family if the ship sinks. What if the ship doesn't sink? Then you're going to give it to somebody whose ship does sink. And that way, that's the way it worked. And so there was the Colossal of Rhodes, the coinage of Rhodes, the money that he invented the idea of making, with a picture, horrible picture of him on one side. And it was rough compared to today's pretty coins, but you could see a picture of a person kind of lightly stamped into there, and it was kind of round because they bored a hole in this metal and poured it in there, or in this clay, and broken the clay and got it out. And on the other side they would put a symbol of some kind of an old-time symbol from the ancient days of the island of Rhodes. I thank you for listening to me talking about Croesus, the richest man on earth when he invented coins, and was the first man to have gold coins. When you hear somebody say, rich as Croesus, that's easy to understand. Why? Because he had all the money until he started giving it out and spending it so that the people would get it, going around from merchant to merchant as they bought things from each other. Thank you.